Well, good evening, everybody. Happy New Year, if we haven't seen you here yet in 2015, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. I'm Jason James. I run the foundation, but I'm also chairing this evening's talk, which is about Womenomics. Well, this is the first in our major seminars this year, and we've chosen as our theme for this year diversity, the pros and cons. And we were thinking it would be interesting to compare the situation in Japan with the situation in the UK. In many ways, the UK is much more diverse and is open to a much wider variety of lifestyles and ethical views and religions and so forth than Japan is. So we are going to contrast various aspects of that over the course of the year. Japan has a very active debate going on about changing some things, including, for instance, allowing more immigration. But as you will know, one of the key policy issues at the moment that's being embraced by Prime Minister Abe is so-called Womenomics, which is about making more effective use of women in the labour force in Japan. So we've got two speakers who are very well placed to tell us about that, and probably neither of them need much introduction to you. First of all, we have Glenn Fukushima. Glenn used to work for the US government. From 1985 to 1990, he was the Director for Japanese Affairs and the Deputy Assistant US Trade Representative at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. So he was very much involved in the trade negotiations going on between the US and Japan in that period. He wrote a book about it, which won a prize. And then from 1990 to 2012, he served in various corporate positions, and certainly for quite a long time was the CEO and I think subsequently chairman of Airbus Japan, which of course is a somewhat political position itself. And more recently, he's moved back to Washington, D.C., and he's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, a think tank in Washington, D.C. So he'll speak first, but I'll just introduce our other speaker at the same time to get it out of the way. Mami Mizutori, who many of you will know, is currently the Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures in Norwich. She's been doing that job since 2011. Previously, she had a career as a high-flying Japanese diplomat. She was, for instance, Director of the National Security Policy Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, United Nations Policy Division, the Status of US Forces Agreement Division. But she's well known to a lot of us here because her second last diplomatic post was as the Director of the Japan Information and Culture Centre at the Embassy in London. And she left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2011, I suppose it was, and came over to the UK and took up her current position, I think later that year, at the Sainsbury Institute. So, Glenn, I'll pass over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Jason, for the kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be back in London, and also very pleased to be back here at the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. The immediate reason for my being here is that I arrived yesterday from Washington, D.C., where it's snowing, so I'm very pleased to be here. But the Cambridge University is having a conference later this month, or this week, and we're participating, and therefore that's the main reason I've come. But I love visiting London, one of my favorite cities, and I'm very pleased that Jason and Shilpa-san have invited me to participate in this program today. I have to begin by saying that I'm not an expert on the subject of Womenomics. However, I'm very interested in the subject for three reasons. The first is, as Jason mentioned, from 1990 to 2012, for 22 years, I worked in Japan for 4 American companies and 1 European company. And during that time, I had the experience of hiring, I guess not firing, but hiring primarily, many Japanese employees, including women. The smallest organization I headed was about 60 people. The largest organization I headed in Japan was about 4,000 people. So I had quite a bit of experience with women in the workplace from that perspective as an employer and as a manager and as CEO of organizations in Japan. My second interest has to do with the fact that I was president and also vice president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. And in that capacity, I had the opportunity to get to know many American and many European companies operating in Japan and hearing about their problems and their challenges and their successes and failures. And so the issue of human resources came up quite frequently in that context. Then the third reason that I'm very interested in this issue, and probably the most significant reason, is that my wife, Saki Fukushima, is from Japan, born and raised in Japan, but has been probably one of the very pioneers in terms of women serving on corporate boards in Japan. And so I'd like to start by talking a little bit about her experience and background, and then based on that, talk about how I view this issue of womenomics. I met my wife in 1970 when we were both college students, and I was at Stanford University. My wife was at Seisen College in Japan. We met at a Japan-America student conference, Nichibei Gakusei Kaigi. And in 1972, right after graduating from college, we got married. And I knew that a couple of years later I would be returning to the United States to go to graduate school. At that time I thought I was going to get a PhD and teach, but in any case, my wife thought that because she would probably have to work to help support me through graduate school, she studied teaching Japanese as a foreign language, first at International Christian University and also at the Japan Foundation and at Waseda Culture Agency and Naganuma School. They were all having programs on how to teach Japanese as a foreign language because of the rise of the Japanese economy, interest in foreign language, interest in the Japanese language by non-Japanese was growing. So she took those courses, and when I went to Harvard for graduate school in 1974, she got a job as an instructor of Japanese at Harvard. So she taught for 6 years at Harvard undergraduates and graduate students, went to the educational school, got her master's degree at Harvard, then was hired to work as a researcher at a management consulting firm in Boston. She found that she liked business, but she thought that in order to be adequately rewarded in business, she should get an MBA. So she went to Stanford Business School, got her MBA, worked at Bain & Company, management consulting firm in Boston and Tokyo for 3 years, and then in 1991 was recruited to join Korn Ferry, one of the world's largest executive search firms, I guess more widely known as headhunters. So there are about 4 or 5 of these major firms, Heidrick & Struggles, Egon Zehnder, Russell Reynolds, Spencer Stuart, Korn Ferry, that specialize in helping especially large multinational corporations and some nonprofits find the appropriate people to run their organizations at the CEO or vice president level. So my wife joined Korn Ferry, worked at Korn Ferry, and was very successful at it. And within a couple of years was promoted to partner, and then she was promoted to be head of the Japan operations of Korn Ferry, which she did for about 9 years. In the meantime, she was selected to be only the second woman to serve on the board of Korn Ferry headquarters in the United States. And she saw the firm go through from a partnership to becoming a corporation, go through the IPO process. So based on this experience, Kao, which is like Procter & Gamble of Japan, approached her in the mid-90s to join their board. And it's interesting that since probably 80 to 90% of Kao's customers are women, but they had never had a woman on their board, my wife turned out to be the first woman to join the board of Kao. And then she was asked to join the board of Sony as the first woman, and then the board of Benesse, which is an owner of Berlitz, and also E-Access, Parco, department store company, and now she's on the board of Bridgestone, the tire company, Ajinomoto, the food company, J-Front Retailing, department store company, and Mitsubishi Corporation. So I frankly don't know too many Japanese who served on so many corporate boards. In addition to the formal corporate boards, she served as an advisory board member of companies such as Itochu, the trading company, and also Kokuyo and the Development Bank of Japan. In addition, the last 4 years she's been Fukudaihyo Kanji, which is, I guess, vice chairman of Keizai Doyukai, the Japan Association of Corporate Executives, one of the 3 large business organizations in Japan. And the head of Keizai Doyukai, Mr. Hasegawa, the chairman of Takeda Pharmaceuticals, assigned my wife to be in charge of all the personnel-related issues that Keizai Doyukai deals with, which means diversity issues, women's issues, as well as issues regarding non-Japanese workers. So through that experience, she has, primarily in the private sector, but also on some government advisory committees, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and some cabinet level advisory committees, has been actively involved in this issue. So a lot of my knowledge of the issues comes from her experience. And just last week, in fact, last Thursday, she was invited to Washington, D.C. to give a speech at the Japan American Society of Washington, D.C. to talk about Womenomics. And the next day she spoke, that was in English, on the next day she spoke to the Japan Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. in Japanese, to a Japanese business audience. So some of what I'm going to say today is based on what she said to those groups as well. So with regard to how I view this issue of Womenomics, as I wrote in the article that you have before you in Forbes Japan, I very much welcome the current Japanese government's initiatives to try to promote women in the workforce in Japan. So I welcome that, but at the same time I'm a little skeptical about the gap between what I see as the public relations on the one hand and the reality on the other. I think that the Abe government has been extremely successful in public relations in many fronts, not only Womenomics, but also when it comes to Arrow 1, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, and so forth, with Abenomics. And one indication of this is that when I was asked to give a talk a few months ago in Washington, D.C. about this issue of women in the workforce, I mentioned the example of my wife. And the next day I got a telephone call from a public relations firm that had been hired by the Japanese government to basically indicate how much women are succeeding in Japan. And so this public relations agency called to say that they wanted to interview my wife to have an article in a magazine that will just show how much Abenomics is changing Japan. So I referred the public relations firm to my wife, but my wife really wasn't very interested, in part because her activities had nothing to do with Abenomics. And so, I mean, it's fine. I mean, I think she felt that it's fine to be used as an example of someone who has been able to, in some case, break the barriers and be able to join corporate boards. But that she's not at all a typical example. And the advances she's made have predate Abenomics. And so, so she actually declined that offer to appear in that article. But I think it just goes to show how hard at work the Abe government is on the public relations front. So, as I wrote in that article, I think there are basically three things, in particular with regard to this women's conference that was held in Japan in September of last year, in which the Japanese government seemed to put a great deal of time and effort and money into, and they invited, I think, Cherry Blair from the UK, and they tried to invite Hillary Clinton, but she wasn't able to go, and invite Christine Lagarde from the IMF and a bunch of other people to come and talk about women in the workplace. And Christine Lagarde actually has expressed an interest, and the IMF came out with a report about can women save Japan a couple of years ago. And my wife actually arranged for Christine Lagarde and Mr. Hasegawa, the head of Keizai Doyukai, to appear on the NHK Close-Up Gendai, a special 1-hour edition of that program chaired by Hiro Kunya, to talk about women in the workplace in Japan. So I just basically want to make three major points. One is that this issue of women in the workplace is a very complicated and deeply rooted issue in Japan, and merely setting up a few daycare centers or merely, having some quotas or targets is not going to solve the problem. Because I think what my wife has learned and what I've learned in my own experience, and also hearing from Japanese companies that are trying to promote women in the workplace, such as, for instance, Shiseido, which has had a considerable amount of success in doing it, is that it basically requires a change in the way that people work. And this means basically the way that men work. What I mean by that is that in many Japanese organizations, people are rewarded based on how much time they spend in the office or with clients. It's often the case in large Japanese companies that employees feel they can't go home if their boss is still at the office. if their boss is at the office until 8 or 10 or 11 o'clock at night, they feel compelled to stay in the office. And the personnel evaluation system, I learned this when I was working for these American and European companies in Japan, which obviously we have to abide by Japanese labor standards. It's very hard to really make distinctions based on performance and results. The system is stacked against it. In fact, I even remember a case where there was obviously some disparities in the abilities and the results produced. And for instance, a sales group within one of the companies I was working for. But some of the some of the managers in this company would voluntarily give some of their results to their people reporting to them so they wouldn't be penalized. And so the performance evaluation system doesn't work because the managers refuse to evaluate their direct reports accurately. They would rather try to spread the wealth and not have distinctions. So in any case, the way the Japanese companies currently operate, at least the large Japanese companies, it would be very difficult, I think, for women, especially women who have children, to be able to compete on a level playing field, because the men are expected to be in the office until 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night, or go out drinking with their customers and clients, or play golf with their customers and clients over the weekend. And so much of the performance evaluation is based on effort as opposed to results. And so companies like Shiseido said they had to change the way the men work and to force the men to be more efficient and to evaluate the employees based on their output and their results. And that is very, very difficult because this whole issue of human relations, ningen kankei, and all this stuff is still quite important when it comes to doing business in Japan. And in a way, you're asking Japan to completely change its way of doing business. And unless you do that, it's going to be very difficult for women to be able to participate on a level playing field, unless something else happens, which is that men take up some of the responsibilities in the home, such as doing the laundry, cleaning the house, taking care of the kids. And all the public opinion polls indicate that there are generational differences, but it's going to be very difficult to get the men, well, it is in any country, I suppose, to get the men to share, say, half of the burden of what it requires to maintain a household. So the first point is that these are very fundamentally rooted problems about the way the Japanese business operates. And so, as I say, just merely making some cosmetic changes are not going to solve the problem. The second point I make in that article is that one of the recommendations of the conference in September that took place in Tokyo was that women ought to be able to have others take care of their kids while they're working. And this issue of having adequate infrastructure, daycare centers, especially for women, has been a major issue and continues to be a major issue. And the Abe government, to its credit, has allocated a considerable amount of money to try to alleviate this problem. But still, there's long waiting lists of families that want to be able to put their children in these daycare centers so that the women can work. And I think this issue of having help, whether it's in these daycare centers or in the home, is really linked to the issue of non-Japanese, that is, of foreigners who, in places like Hong Kong or Singapore or other countries in Asia where certainly American and European expats have had the experience of having people who are able to take care of their children, not necessarily the nationalities of the country they're living in. But Japan, because of its very strict immigration laws, makes it very difficult for non-Japanese to work in that kind of capacity. I myself, I don't have kids. My parents, my wife and I don't have kids, but in many of the companies I work for, I've had the experience, and also in the American Chamber, of these non-Japanese executives wanting to have help, but finding it extremely difficult to get the Japanese immigration authorities to allow people to come from other countries of Asia to be helpers. So that is, I think, another element, this issue of immigration and the role that non-Japanese, whether at the professional level or at the manual labor level, how that's going to be dealt with. And that is an issue that has not been confronted yet in Japan. And then the third issue is that the conference came out with this recommendation about how it's important for top management to be firmly committed to promoting women. And it's very true. If you talk to companies like Daiwa Securities, for instance, or Shiseido, where the CEOs really did have a very firm commitment to promote women, it took that kind of commitment in order to get others to go along. I specifically remember Daiwa Securities. I think it was one of the senior executives of Daiwa Securities at Keizai Doikai session said that when Daiwa Securities tried to promote women to be account managers for important Japanese customers, clients, institutional clients, the clients would sometimes call up and say, why did you assign this woman to be on our account? Do you think our company is so insignificant that you would appoint a woman to take care of our account? And so the CEO had to actually call them to say, no, it's because this particular woman, who happens to be this particular manager who happens to be a woman, is a very capable person, and because she is so capable, we are assigning her on your account. And so he actually had to personally persuade the CEO of the Japanese company to allow this woman to work, and basically the Daiwa person said, well, try her out for 6 months or a year and see how it goes, and if you're really dissatisfied after 1 year, we'll consider replacing her. But apparently she proved herself so that the client was very happy with her performance. But she said that he said that if the CEO had not intervened and backed up the woman manager, that she wouldn't have been given that chance. So I think the commitment at the top is very important. And I think the Western media have certainly given Prime Minister Abe a lot of credit for appointing 5 women to his second cabinet. And so on the level of assigning 5 women, I suppose one would have to give him credit. In terms of the views of those 5 women, at least 4 of the 5, I think there are a lot of people who question their commitment to promoting women in the workplace, since I think one in particular is a person who's known to be against abortion, which is quite rare in Japan. Another is a person who was against sex education in the schools, again, quite rare in Japan. But so I guess, you know, we should give Mr. Abe credit for appointing women as cabinet members, but I guess my hope is that he would appoint women who actually have been active in trying to promote women in the workplace, and to have those people in those positions would actually prove more productive. The final thing I would say, since my time is coming up, is that those of us who observe change in Japan, I think, always confront the issue where many people in Japan would say, things are changing so much. You know, can't you see how much things have changed? And I think it's true, including on this issue of women, that if you compare the situation now to 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, there has been considerable movement. But if you compare the situation now to the situation in other countries, then I think the changes in Japan don't seem all that impressive. In fact, I think you know, the World Economic Forum, their study showed, what is it, 104 out of 145 countries, excuse me, I think 104 out of 145 countries in terms of gender parity. And one last anecdote I'll give you is that in 2004, the Corporate Women Directors International organization did a study of the board composition of the Fortune 200 companies. Companies around the world that were the largest companies under the Fortune rankings. At that time, in 2004, there were 27 Japanese companies. When they looked at the board composition of the 27 companies, they found that there were 3 individuals out of those 27 companies. Probably, there's 15 to 20 maybe board members in each, so maybe 450 to 500 members, of whom 3 were found to be women. Now, most people said this was a pretty small number, and it was a small number compared to most other countries. However, it turned out that of the 3, one of them was actually a man. Because, there was my wife on Sony board. There was Sato Kinko on the Hitachi board. The other person, whose first name was Chiaki, and Chiaki is like Dana or Leslie, and it could be male or female. And apparently they didn't look at the Japanese characters, they just looked at the Romaji, the English transliteration. And they said, Chiaki, there must be a woman. So they thought it was a woman, but actually it was a male. Actually it was only 2. So that was 0.7% of the board members of the Fortune top 27 largest Japanese companies were women. Now, in 2013, 10 years later, when they did the same survey, there were 10 women. So it went from 2 to 10. So it went from 0.7% to 3.1% apparently of the board members. So you can certainly say that's progress, and we can't deny that that is progress, but it's from a very low base, and it's probably going to take a lot of time if things continue the way they are. And I'm sure in the question and answer session we'll have an opportunity to talk about some changes that might result in some step function changes as opposed to gradual changes. But my time has come up, so I will cede the podium to thank you.
Thank you. I think the most important part of these events are the Q&A, so I will really try to be quite concise. I'd like to start from where Glenn ended. My big question, I keep on thinking, why are we where we are in the 21st century, 2015? Why is Japan so bad when it comes to gender equality? Maybe it's not only about gender equality, it's about diversity, the whole theme of these series. And I'm going to throw you a theory that you might think, no, that's not it, but I think there's something to it. I just feel that in Japan, women themselves never have fought for their rights. It was under the occupation with the current constitution, under the Article 24, that gender equality was given to us, right? There's a famous lady, American Jewish lady, Beatrice Gordon, who was a member of the GHQ. She wrote that part ardently, and everybody knows about her. She passed away 2 years ago, and there was a lot of obituaries. And I think it's a great story, but I think, why is it that it had to be an American woman who wrote this for us? And when you compare it to here, I think about the suffragettes. Now, of course, you might say that why do you have to kill yourself or starve yourself or whatever to get those rights? But it's so different, the contrast. People here, and even before the rather radical suffragettes, I think you all know that there were women who kept on diligently writing to Parliament saying that we want the right to vote, and it didn't work, so Emily Pankhurst and her 3 daughters, they started to do more radical things, illegal things that probably not all of you agree to, but I think there's something in that women themselves fought for this. And of course in Japan there are many Japanese activists, some quite famous people like Ichika Ofsae or others, who fought not only for women's rights but for civil rights. But when you think about it, I really can't, and correct me later if I'm wrong, but I can't really think about a collective movement that was led by the Japanese women themselves. And maybe the bigger question is why, but I just think that is maybe one element why we are where we are now. And I think, but then we can't stop there, we have to progress. So we have to think what we can do. And I think that always the UK is a very good example for us to emulate, because United States, with all due respect to Glenn, it's such a dynamic country. It's difficult for Japanese to learn from what's happening in the United States. But when you look at what's happening here, I think the gap is still not that large, but you are way ahead of us. And I think there are things that we can learn. And I wanted to share with you, I think a lot of you saw this article this morning in the Times, that yesterday the first woman bishop was consecrated. This is where you are compared to where we are. And I did a bit of a survey when I wrote an article, what's happening here in different sectors. So Glenn talked about the 5 women ministers. Now, of course it was going to be a failure because we don't have enough women MPs to start to, right? We only have 8% of women of the whole lower house, and that's, I think, like 127th in the league table of 189 countries, according to the International Parliament Union. If you only have that few women, how can you have 5 women cabinet members? It's impossible. You have to start from having more women MPs, but then for that, you have to start to have more women candidates. And here, in contrast, 33% of the Labour MPs are women, 16 of the Conservatives are women, 13 of the Lib Dems are women, but it didn't happen just like that. Labour had this policy of having a only women shortlist in some constituencies, and that's how you gradually built this up. So that's what you need to do, and that's what happened here. When you look at the government, Abe-san said that let's have 30% of the senior management of all the ministries to be women, which again is a good policy, but again there is not enough women yet. Now we have to work towards that. I was in Japan December, and a good friend of mine who's a senior official in one of the ministries, she is like number 2 now, and she actually wants to change her career. And she went to her boss and said, I've worked enough and I'd like to do something different. And he said, you cannot quit, because if you quit, we cannot meet the quota of 30%. I'll have to stay. And she was so frustrated. But you know, that's an episode, but that's how it's right now. But here, you may know that 30%, no, 53% of all civil servants are women. 37% of civil servants earning more than 60K annually are women. And also all these public posts, like the director of the British Museum, the head of BBC, 39% are women currently, and the government has set a target that 50% should be women. So they're actually, very actively promoting this. The military, in all 3 services, I don't know about the Marine, maybe few, but in the other services, more than 10% are women. In the Army, the number is the lowest. Why? Because there's still a debate about whether or not you will allow women to be combat elements at the front. Now, that's a big debate, and I'm sure that people have different, opinions about that. In the United States, they've just recently, last year, they've said it's going to happen. I think in Australia, they have also started to do that. Here, it's still a debate. But still, 10% of all 3 services. The church, I just showed you this. I think the important story about this is that it was a difficult decision. It didn't happen easily. We all know that 3 years ago, there was votes in the Synod, and they said no. And there were people who were dismayed, but people who were happy that it didn't happen. But then you had a new Archbishop of Canterbury, and people kept on debating. I think it's very important that the debate kept on going, and I'm sure that even now, maybe in this room, of those who are of the Anglican Church, not all of you might think it's a good thing, not all of you might think that according to the Bible, that's correct, but the thing is that you had a vote, it happened, and now I think majority of the people have accepted it. So that's important as a process. In the business sector, you might have heard of the Davis report. So Lord Davis, who was the minister in charge of business under the Labour government, he was charged to write up this report about what Glenn was talking about, the percentage of women on the board of the FTSE 250 companies. And people, the companies were worried because they thought, are they going to impose legal obligation on us? They stopped short of that, but they said that all FTSE 250 companies have to set their own target. They have to announce it. And in 2013 and 2015, they have to report whether they have met the target. And the report will be open to the public. And so some companies have set very low targets, but a lot of them have set quite high targets. Not all the targets have been met yet. And I think 2013, when the first report of the follow-up came out, the report concluded that there's a lot of progress, but it's not enough. And if progress will not be accelerated by 2015, maybe we need to think about numerical legal targets. Now, again, I think the process, the transparency of the process, and the will of people around that, working around that, maybe not everybody is happy about that, but the process itself is very important. And when I look at that, I think there are a lot of things that probably Japan can learn from that. If we really think that diversity in terms of gender equality is important. I would like to present 5 observations that I have, looking at the Japanese situation and looking at the situation here, and hopefully it will be food for thought for the debate. One is, I think that strong leadership, like in the case of Womenomics, is of course welcome, but that's not enough. You need strong leadership, but you need a debate which really engages everybody who will be affected by this. And when I say that, I'm not only talking about women, it's also about men. Everybody has to debate about it, and the differences, the objections, those negative, I wouldn't say negative, but different opinions have to come up to the surface. And unless you go through this, you can't just say, okay, now we're going to promote women, 30%, 45%, whatever. It's not going to happen. So I think the first point is, I believe that in addition to strong political leadership, you need a debate. The second thing is, and this is what disturbs me most about Womenomics, you have to argue, why are we making this happen? Because to my ears, and I may be a bit too sensitive about this, it doesn't seem to me that Womenomics in Japan is about gender equality. I feel that it's a policy to fill the gap in the labor market. We don't have enough people in the labor market, so we're going to recruit women, we're going to recruit senior citizens, and they have to fill the market. Now, economically that's fine, but if that's the major thrust of this debate, there's going to be a limit to where it's going to be going. I think Abe-san maybe have stopped to use it, but he was using this word katsuyo, which in English means utilization. So government officials and even the media, they keep on saying utilization of women. I mean, come on. It's not about utilization about women, is it? So I think we have to start from the basic point of why are we making this happen. It's not only about utilizing women. And thirdly, this is what Glenn was saying, and I totally agree with him. This is about the whole debate of what kind of society we want to build. And that's why, going back to the first point, we need everybody to talk about it. because it's not only about how women work, but it's also about how men work, how the society is going to function. There's this word in Japan that is used a lot, work-life balance. But it sounds quite shallow when you use it in Japan because it's used so much. And while you say work-life balance, but still, as Glenn said, there's too much work going on. So it's about the whole society. And by the way, when you think about it, currently the women in Japan, I don't think are very excited about Womenomics because it's too much. Because on one hand, they're told, go and work. But then they're also told, have more children. Work, have more children, work, have more children. I mean, you know, it's not possible. And at the same time, as Glenn said, so who's going to take care of the children? The September conference in Japan with Cheryl Blair, Lagarde coming, honestly, I don't think a lot of people were interested in it. I think everybody wants to see, okay, if you want us to work and have children, what are you going to do to make it possible? I think people who are interested in this are keenly following the debate at the Diet, the legislations that will pass, that will enable this to happen. So the whole debate about what kind of society we want to have, plus what kind of mechanism will the government provide so that it will happen is important. The fourth thing is, I touched upon it a bit, is that I really think that the procedure, the process of making things happen is very important. I don't think that in Japan that it is not going to work if the government sets a numerical target which makes it a legal obligation for companies to have a certain amount of women on the board. But I think if it's only a very idealistic target, it's not going to work either. So that's why I introduced the example of the Davis report, which I think is short of a legal obligation, but quite a strict procedure and a transparent one. So I think that's very important. And the fifth point I wanted to make, and the last one, is that I think this should be dealt as an element of the whole debate about diversity. It's not only about gender, it's about ethnicity, it's about immigration, it's about same-sex marriage, how gaiety is debated or not debated in society. You can't just single out this element and say, okay, let's work on this. It's about the whole issue about how diversity is seen in Japan, whether it's going to be welcome, whether it's encouraged, or whether, as I said, they're only using the argument in order to patch the economic issues that we have. I hope that's not the case. I think that a lot of people want to see this agenda moving forward, not only under this government, but in successive governments. But in order to make that happen, I think that there are really very key fundamental issues that have to be addressed. And I think in addressing these issues, it's always very important to look at examples of other countries, what's happening in other countries, what's not happening. So I think that the fact that Daiwa is taking up this debate about diversity is great. And I think that one way or another, these debates that take place outside Japan, about Japan, it would be great if you can find a way to take it back to Japan.